Welcome back to the show. I'm here with John Farrar, and he is an active community member in the ColdFusion community, and he focuses on strategy that will bring impact without getting delayed over engineering. And we're going to talk a bit about that more later. And he's giving a talk called VUE More With Less, which I think there's a pun in there because Vue is a JavaScript library. So we're going to be covering what is VueJS for those folks who haven't figured that out yet, and how he used to avoid JavaScript and how it advanced ColdFusion because he did that, why he moved beyond jQuery, what problems do the various JS frameworks solve, and how you should pick a framework. Hint there, it's not just a popularity contest, guys. The interesting story of how JavaScript has evolved over the years, how VueJS makes JavaScript super friendly, the challenges of being in the framework's Olympic circle, and why he's concerned about the mounting technical debt in companies today. Now, I'm not talking about the US national debt, it's technical debt. So welcome, John.
Hello.
Glad to be here. What the heck? Yes, hello, welcome to the podcast. So glad you're here. So what exactly is VueJS?
VueJS is another one of those libraries, and I'll probably talk in that later, some of the things you mentioned there. But VueJS, when version 1 was out, it was really cool looking, had a lot of promise, but it wasn't holistic enough that I was ready to drop an investment of my time in encouraging others to. But when version 2 shipped, it really took off. And what VueJS is, a lot of us have heard of the phrase single page applications. I'm a part of the people out here who are trying to change that phrase, because when you use a phrase that doesn't describe it well, it confuses people. And what I do is I call it a progressive web app. And what that basically means is you've got a web app and you're basically building an entire client that is running inside the browser. And it's more than just not refreshing the page because we're changing the data on a grid. It's more than just not refreshing the page because we're cycling through a slideshow. What's actually happening is the page that you load, the whole page can change without going back and pulling a whole new page from the browser. So you have pages and pages of content running more like a desktop application than a browser application. So it's pages within an application, but all run in one request. Well, except for, of course, the extra requests or stuff you're doing. And mixing those pieces together, it just makes for an experience where your web apps actually feel like a desktop application. They don't feel like a web application anymore. So VueJS is one of the leading libraries that does that. It really makes it simple. Of course, there's a level of complexity to anything, but one of my standards for software, wherever I work or consult, is I have a little acronym I use. It has to be ASC-oriented. That's ASC, which means approachable, sustainable, and collaborative. VueJS
could be taken another way when you said ASC-orientated.
Yes, ASC, ask. But if you don't say it right, you're going to have someone, be careful, you can be misunderstood. But there's so many things that have come out. Angular 1 was very approachable up front, but as you worked with it day in and day out, there were a lot of people who had extreme pain points with it, and they learned how to solve them as a community. And you had so many people who were so invested in Angular 1 because they had invested deeply and hard into it. And then when Angular 2 shipped, there was blood being spilled because it broke the chain of progressive upgrade. But that happens. And by the way, that's why I didn't jump in with Vue 1. That's why I didn't jump in with jQuery 1. There's some languages I've determined from the start they would upgrade smooth. But well, Microsoft used to have a motto. I'm not saying they practiced it. I'm only saying it was a motto. And that was never first, never last. And that's actually a really good business motto. And you can choose for yourself how well they did at practicing eating their own dog food there. But it's still a good motto.
So that way you're not on the bleeding edge when the first version comes out, but you don't miss the boat,
right?
You know, by later versions.
And if you're going to be in the bleeding edge, then there we go. Jim Collins, I can't remember which of his books it was in, but he's talked about fire bullets before cannonballs. Steve Blank talks about it. He says you need to invest small until you have a winning product, and then you pour your fuel in. A lot of people invest too much too soon. And it's okay to be bleeding edge as an experiment, as a test. But when you go whole hog with bleeding edge, you're reducing your chances of winning. That's not good. So, but VueJS 2, I think they're in there. I'm behind it. In fact, I didn't mention earlier, I have a project that we can talk about later if we have time or want, but I'm looking at building an open community project called the Open Learning Server. So, but I'll save that.
Cool. So why did you used to avoid using JavaScript? And how did that end up advancing ColdFusion?
Well, my years of JavaScript and web programming go back all the way to before Internet Explorer 3. In fact, I don't have it anymore, but I actually got a t-shirt from Microsoft because I was one of the first 100 people to download Internet Explorer 3.
Oh.
And that's when they were ramping up their battle with Netscape. But back in those days, if you wrote JavaScript for Internet Explorer or Netscape or any other browser out there, that's where it ran right. And you had to write another version for this browser and another version for that browser. And back then, to be honest, I didn't, and most people didn't even know how to detect which browser you were using. So that was a difficult point. If you don't know which browser you're using, you basically put a sign on your website that says this site runs with this browser. And if it didn't work, they saw that sign and you tried to force people to Netscape or Internet Explorer, and JavaScript was a work of penance. It was just horrible. Now, to that point, I mentioned that JavaScript advanced ColdFusion. Nowadays, we've got jQuery, we've got all these libraries, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff in the front end. You've got handlebars, you can do templating, and you can just transform a person's website on the front end. But before JavaScript was really alive and functional, that forced us to change stuff on the back end. So as funny as it sounds, as poorly as JavaScript was running, JavaScript created an appetite to do stuff that was dynamic. But it didn't deliver the promise of dynamic because it didn't run the same from one browser to the next. So what actually happened is it created an appetite that actually pushed the server platforms where we had dynamic websites, but they weren't dynamic through JavaScript. They were dynamic through a back-end language that could change the pages with data and stuff and send a fresh page, even though it was the same URL, it was a different page depending on how the user interacted with the site. And that was the time when ColdFusion was coming up. So JavaScript, being as bad as it was, actually was one of the reasons that ColdFusion prospered.
So you eventually did get into jQuery.
Yes, I did. In fact, I had a transition point between there where I was doing prototype, and you know Rick Mason, I believe. He
Yeah,
runs a
I know Rick.
ColdFusion user group on Lansing, Michigan, the capital. Well, we had back when Ajax was coming up, he invited me up to speak in Ajax, and you're going to love this. You'd think that someone who's last year was married 30 years, it wasn't last year, it was obviously a few years ago when Ajax was coming up, but he planned this meeting and he told me that there was only one person who ever drew more people to his meeting than I did with that meeting. And you know, that was obviously Ben Forta. But the real funny thing though, is it was not the day you would have expected a big meeting, because neither Rick or I were smart enough to remember that the second Tuesday of the month is always when he was holding his meetings. It happened to be April 14th. February 14th. So we planned the meeting on Valentine's Day.
Oh, not the best day to do a meeting.
And yet we had an unbelievable turnout, and they really liked it, but that was with prototype. And then as jQuery went into version 2 and got traction, I really jumped into that community. And because I just saw what they were doing, how they were connecting the pieces, I thought jQuery was solving the challenges that developers were dealing with the best. And that's how I rate any JavaScript framework. What are the current challenges? And that's half of it. What do you think the challenges are? Because one of the things Steve Blank says is there are no facts inside the building. It's part of the startup manifesto in his book. And what he means by that is, he says, he's a college professor and he jokes about it. He says, we all have hypotheses. He said, that's just a word a college professor uses so he can sound educated. He says, what they actually are is guesses. He says, and our guesses are exactly that. We don't know until we test. And if we test and we're right, then it was a good guess. He says, but we don't know until we test. There's no facts inside the building. We do the same thing with our frameworks. Is jQuery great? Okay, well, we test it. You know, we fire those bullets for cannonballs. We see if it really works. If it's working for us, we invest deeper. And when we do that with our frameworks, we start to find out what they're about. And that's what we should be doing with our frameworks. And jQuery, with the problems that people are actually having, did a wonderful job at solving the real world problems that people were dealing with. And that's how come the reason I was right is because I tested a lot of those things. It wasn't as much intuition as it was the process.
So what problems do the different jQuery frameworks solve? You know, if we look at jQuery or VueJS or React or Angular.
Well, jQuery has a number of libraries out there, including they've got like jQuery UI. Obviously, it solved the need to make dealing with the UI from JavaScript more approachable. In fact, I do a lot of this. I run it through that little ASC acronym. It made it more approachable. The code was more sustainable. When you went back, you could update the code. Someone else could see what you had done. That was the whole thing. And the whole collaborative thing, it was just very approachable, sustainable, and collaborative for the problems it was solving. jQuery itself, when you wanted to interact with a DOM, you know, that you turn your HTML into this document object model, but interacting with that was difficult back then. You had still the problem of the different browsers running different. But when you use jQuery, the differences were negated. You could write one set of JavaScript, and jQuery was one of the big pushes and paradigm shifts in thinking that made us believe. In fact, I think jQuery, one of the biggest contributions it made is it did so much at helping so many people to write one set of JavaScript that ran everywhere, that the browser vendors stopped creating unique JavaScript because it didn't help them. They could not control the market by writing unique JavaScript. So thank you, jQuery, for putting an end to that craziness.
So in
So it
effect,
had
it's like having a virtual Java engine on top of JavaScript, and you don't have to
yes.
care what the JavaScript underneath is.
So jQuery had a technical social impact that a lot of people have not realized they may be the highest impact thing that has brought us to a single compatible JavaScript and CSS. I think they are perhaps the biggest player in that game. And that's the top award I would give jQuery.
So what about React? What's the problem that's solving?
React, when you start moving up into single page applications, progressive web apps, what you're doing is you're trying to run a site without hitting the browser when you go to different parts of the site. You're actually running the site in the browser, and you may pull a new template for a page, but the page is already there. And that's what React did. Is React, of course, is a project by Facebook. And React, still, one thing it doesn't do is prevent fake news. But what it does do is they were trying to build this thing where they're interacting with a back-end server. They've got all these parts of the page running at once, and they need everything to be running together off sort of this data model. And what they call that in React is a state. So this is the state of my data. And when you change data, the user interface automatically updates. You add another row, it adds another row to the table. So it's a responsive UI. And that's what it's doing. It's reacting to the data state. And that's what's really cool about it is I'm not going to hit the technical side of it, how it does it, but basically React does this and so does Vue. They create a copy of the DOM that is not actually running on the DOM, because one of the slowest things your browser does is update the view. Reading the view and querying it and updating the view is just one of the slowest things it does, just like one of the slowest things we do with the server is hit our database. Same type of thing. And Angular 2 has this type of feature too. But by creating this shadow, this copy of the DOM, when they change something, they compare it to the copy. And then they rewrite the DOM from the copy because they can see what the changes were. And by splitting that out, all of a sudden, Facebook became very responsive, very fast. And that's why React changed the whole game. So that's the kudos for React. And that's one of the big wins because they changed the way JavaScript runs. jQuery, what it does is it's actually make it easier to interact, easier to search the DOM. It's making that code so it's more standard. It's not solving the same problem. In fact, so far, I haven't seen anyone take and build a jQuery library that is solving that problem. So, and if it did, I don't technically think it would be jQuery. So, but that gets to that whole concept, what you brought up earlier, the Olympic winner circle. Okay, we've had over the years, I remember when I was a kid, one of my favorite, Mark Spitz and Bruce Jenner, they were, Olympic athletes that I remember. They just did an incredible job. But I don't think any of those guys have considered going to the Olympics for more than a decade because it would just look embarrassing, especially with the Olympic crowd. Everybody has their season where they shine, where they perform. And the problems that we have with the internet, a lot of the problems we faced back then, well, they were solved. And these tools like jQuery solved it better than anyone else. And the motto for jQuery used to be do more with less. That's why my talk is called VUE More With Less, because for me, it's the next evolution and taking the same type of fun and benefit I used to have in jQuery. And it seems like every once in a while, you're coming up with new challenges, and they're stacking up, and a new solution comes along that just really super solves your problems. And we all say it, this is fun. And jQuery and Prototype before that, VueJS, all of these are JavaScript tools that to me have reignited new fun into my programming career.
So you also mentioned Angular there. What's the problem that framework solves?
Angular it's a more rich beast. Whether we like it or not, in fact, I don't know if all the listeners know, but it used to be Angular 2, and then they were talking about Angular 4 has come out now. But the new thrust is it's Angular.
Oh.
they're dropping the versions. It's just going to be Angular. So as you hear about it in the future and you're just hearing Angular, there's a reason for that. Because they want to be progressive and backwards compatible. So the shift they had moving from 1 to 2, part of the goal of that shift is to maintain backwards compatibility. But it's solving a lot of that same type of thing. The difference is Angular is more of a deeply object-oriented solution, where I would say React and VueJS are more of an MVVM solution. So model, view, model. So it's solving things a lot more in that direction. Currently, if you're building mobile applications, there's probably more tools out there for mobile apps that are Angular based.
And then what's the problem that VueJS is solving?
VueJS it's solving the browser side of the problems at this point. Have you heard of Weeks? Do you know what that is?
I've heard of it, yeah. Tell us what it is.
Weeks is the Chinese mobile superstar. It's sort of like Ionic. And Weeks has committed to their platform being Vue.js oriented. And they're the superstar in China. So we probably in America, we're not as familiar with it. Where we would know about all of our stuff over here like Ionic, we just don't hear it as much. But it's probably not a coincidence that they jumped in there. Because do you know who created Vue? No,
tell us who.
You.
Oh.
His name is actually You.
You.
His name is You, and yes, that is fun to do to people. What did he say? But, so it was created by You. Evan You, I believe is his name. And he happens to be Chinese also. I'm not sure where he lives at the moment, but so the fact that he, of course, speaks the language gave him a bit of an inroad with Weeks because he can interact with them in the same language. But I will tell you this, the Vue site, it's full English. It is absolutely amazing. So if you can Google it and hit it, it is just a super site. It's one of the best documented sites I have been to. Of course, like anything, heard the gentleman who runs the Laracast site, he said, okay, by the way, he said, if you want to learn technology, you do not learn technology with documentation. He says it might be something good. He says you need a training resource to learn. Documentation has a purpose, but it's not the best way to learn something. So Vue.js, their site, though, it is absolutely incredible. There are some sites. They've got community's a glitter-based site. It's, for some reason, I didn't go Slack. I guess not everybody goes to Slack. So, but the problems it solves is just building an interactive site, and the way it builds code is just super friendly. In fact, one of my favorite things it does is on the same page, I create a template, which is your classic web template, and then it has a section of interactive code there, not too detailed, you still break the pieces off, but it's enough that it's on the same page in another segment. And at the bottom, it has script. And you can, not script, styles. And you can give it a little keyword, and those styles will wire themselves up so that they only impact the template on that file. So you don't have styles that are leaking all over the place, and you're not putting the styles up inside your code. And it is the classic styles. It's just really cool because it works, it's simple. Someone can come back and share your code. It's very collaborative. You can come back in 6 months and your code still makes sense. For those of us who've programmed a while, we know that scared us more than once when we were first getting started.
Yeah.
You're looking at how much, have you ever done this, Michael? Because I know I did this 2 or 3 times before I started learning to code differently. I'd go back and look at code and I'm like, who wrote this? And I go back and look at the records and it's like, oh, me. I'm glad I didn't say that out loud.
Well, I often tell people when they're writing code, you know, you need to write code to be maintainable, easy to read, have some documentation and other conventions, not just for other people who are going to read it, but for your future self in a year's time who's going to read it.
Right. And that's why, speaking of which, over the years, I've got into that concept of technical debt. It's hard when you work at a company and they're so deep into production that they're not documenting stuff. And I'm not an ultra documenter. It's like, I like this phrase, your code should be well documented, but documentation is not an excuse for poorly written code.
Well, and if it's really well written, it almost documents itself.
Right, and that's the goal. You write code that's self-documenting, but we all know that something you're doing is foreign to new guys, document it. Something you're doing, well, you did have a production constraint, so you couldn't actually make it as nice as it should have, document it. So do that type of thing, make it approachable. But I like the fact that like Vue, it's the way it's organized, it takes a new developer and it kind of stinks from our perspective because they're writing this code that's sort of self-documented and you're like, yeah, it's just where I started. I was that good when I started too.
So what exactly, how would you define technical debt if people haven't come across that term?
Technical debt is you're running around, you're coding, and there's things that you need to fix. Or I'm writing this, I'm writing another page, I'm writing another page, and then I come back and do an update. And what happens is your productivity starts to decline because you're trying to manage all these shortcut issues, or I'm going to be as productive as possible issues. And while you can do that, that process ends up costing you more time in the long range or more features, etc., less upgradability. And writing that way, all those conflicts you have, that's what I call technical debt. We all have technical debt. It's not a question of do you have
that would be personal
debt.
Technical debt though, right? Not national technical debt.
Correct. Although that's the first health website that went up obviously had a boatload of technical debt. They did get that worked out. Since they couldn't get it to run right, it was a classic example of technical debt. And they just about had to rebuild that thing to correct it. So, or in another thing, you know, technical debt can be vulnerabilities. About a month ago, Amazon had someone just type a command in and just about brought down their whole Amazon farm. Had all kinds of big companies that lost their sites came down. That's another example of technical debt. You do testability and there's lots of things, but none of us have enough time to correct it all. So how do you solve it? You pick technologies that solve your most critical issues first. Number two, you create tests that are the highest critical level And then when you come back, you can, oh, well, here's a bug. Okay, you create a test that goes with this bug so that test never sticks its head up twice. Because when a customer comes back to you with the same bug, you're destroying your business. You will lose their confidence and your customers' trust in your integrity. And I'm not just talking about moral integrity, I'm talking about your technical integrity. You have to maintain that, and that's where technical debt, there's just all those issues that come in and chew at you. Some of the speakers, they're talking about, trying to think some of your podcasts, different areas like load testing, someone's talking about NGIX, there we go, can't say it right, what is it? NGIX, how do we say that?
NGIX.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a clever way of spelling
I could do it before
NGIX.
I was sitting here, but it just...
Oh, I have the same problem.
So, all of those things. And Charlie has a good talk coming up on that. It's like...
Yeah, he does.
I love it when there's 2 tracks, but I hate it when there's 2 tracks because I want to be in both sessions.
Well, you need a multiple personality disorder so you can append both at the same time, you know. But I don't know how to do this, but I just had this sudden idea. What if there were, you know how the national debt, they have that clock in Times Square that shows how many trillions of dollars we all owe as US citizens.
Yes.
What if every company had like some kind of measurement of how much technical debt they had, and that was a publicly available measure, and you can see how much it's racking up, you know, every day.
Well, there actually are some measurements. If you watch the company morale, if you watch you just look at those signs. In fact, it's one of the things I use in my life coaching. I tell people it's back to that questions concept. If you will just record the questions that you're asking yourself and know when new questions are arising, you can monitor the new questions because it's a new signal. And that new signal is just like analytics. If we kept a question journal and actually used frequently asked questions as an analytics tool, okay, if we're getting this question over and over, it isn't because people are stupid. It's because we're trying to interface our customer with our software instead of our software with our customer. And we do that stuff. It's crazy. Well, you know, it's funny. We understand that usability is interfacing our software with our customer. Well, when we're doing stuff like VueJS or ColdFusion, here's a wild one. That little command, how you write the code, how you organize your code, your methodology for coding, your frameworks, the problems it solves, that is the same thing. Well, it's the same kind of thing as you have an interface that you interact with your customer, your GUI. The way your code works is an interface that interacts with your developers. And a lot of people, and we had some errors in this in our past in the ColdFusion community also, where we were so bent on being pure object-oriented that we weren't looking how do coders interact with it. Are they actually more productive? We were all about the technical excellence without seeing if it actually accomplished anything business-wise. And it did accomplish stuff, but we needed to figure out where it won, where it didn't. And our technical excellence actually for a season started pointing us to technical debt. So it was a bit of an irony where our excellence was hurting us.
So you talked a little bit earlier about how you pick a framework, and you don't just go for the most popular one. And tell us a bit about that. You mentioned it has to solve the actual problem you have. And we talked about some of the problems these different frameworks solve. And you wanted it to be fun as well. Are there any other criteria you use when you're picking a new framework?
Yes, there are. I went with I helped out as a friend of mine. His company had actually moved from ColdFusion to, you can probably guess, WordPress.
Ooh.
Yes, it's like, but it was a friend, so I went and helped him out. And we looked at using jQuery mobile because we thought maybe this would solve the need. But as we started using it, we found out that it just had issues. We ran into problems with, how do I even code this? Number one. Number two, well, the screen isn't refreshing right. So Google's penalizing us because they have what they call above the fold. And what it means is when your web page first loads, that code from the top of your screen to the bottom of your screen, that needs to display as quick as possible. Anything below that border, you could have a web page that's 20 pages long. It doesn't matter. You don't need to send any of those graphics. You don't need to, all of that stuff is not, and you go to page, Google has a tool called Page Speed. And if you go to that tool, it'll show you. And as we started digging into that and, firing those bullets, it just wasn't performing. So what they figured out is, although they were looking at doing that, looking to move to a different platform, we actually went back and we rewrote their site with Bootstrap, because Bootstrap mobile first did everything we needed. And what they really needed was to rewrite the Bootstrap stuff instead of move to mobile. And that same thing, why were we considering that? Well, we were considering that because that's when Google split, and some people know this, some don't. But if you have a website that's publicly visible, then you have 2 listings for every page on Google. Google scans your page as a mobile browser, and they scan your page as a desktop browser. And if they rate them completely separate. So how long does a person spend on your page? That's probably the biggest influencing fact of where you list in the Google engine. And they will also prejudge you.